So we're very, very lucky to have Sensei Aaron Proffitt. We were trying to get him as a participant in our live event for months. He's very sought after. He's an important scholar. He plays a major role in our tradition. He'll be going to Japan in October for his first level ordination. And so we're very, very thankful and happy to be able to land him as one of our live event speakers. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Aaron Proffitt. As I said, we've been trying to get him for a long time. I'm really impressed with his ability to teach and his outlook on Buddhism. He will be talking about Mahayana Buddhism as something that's alive and living. And I think in the United States, at least speaking for myself, I don't think I fully appreciated the uniqueness and the approach of Mahayana Buddhism when compared to Theravadan or to popular Buddhism as it's portrayed in the United States. So Dr. Aaron Proffitt is an associate professor of Japanese studies at the University at Albany-SUNY, State University of New York, and holds a PhD in Buddhist studies from the University of Michigan. His book, Esoteric Pure Land Buddhism, was recently published by the University of Hawaii Pure Land Buddhist Studies Series. The book's available on Amazon, and I was able to purchase it. He's also a certified minister's assistant with the New York Buddhist Church. He's also the co-founder of the Albany Buddhist Sangha. And he's also, as I mentioned earlier, an aspirant for tokudo, first level ordination within the Jodo Shinshu tradition, this October 2025. So we had to squeeze him in before he leaves for a 14-day or longer ordination training. So thank you very much, Sensei. Please take the floor.
All right. Thank you so much for the kind invitation. Everyone can hear me and see me okay? Excellent. All right, very good. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to talk for a little bit, do my little introduction to some of the ideas and that I want to get into, and then we'll open it up for discussion. I'm interested to hear your questions, thoughts, reflections, and so on. So let's get started. Let's see. Start with the PowerPoint. All right. So the idea behind this talk is thinking through Mahayana Buddhism. Now, there are lots of different textbook presentations of Buddhism around the world, and Mahayana Buddhism is often presented in particular ways, sometimes more accurate or less. Mahayana is pretty vast, so it's hard to cover everything. But what I wanted to point to today is this idea of Mahayana Buddhism as living Buddhism. So not just we would say this distinction between Mahayana ideas as abstractions and then the lives of ordinary people on the other hand, but also as if you go to Higashi Honganji, right up the street from Kyoto Station, there's a slogan that says something like "Ima inochi ga anata o ikiteru" or something like that. Now life is living you. Okay. If you go up to Koya-san, you see a similar slogan, something like "Ikaseru inochi," right? The life that is living you, referring to either Amitabha Buddha, the kind of cosmic Buddha, Mahavarochana Buddha, or the eternal Shakyamuni we find in the Lotus Sutra, or Vairochana Buddha in the Flower Garland Sutra. All of these as kind of not just Buddha as a guy that lived long ago, but Buddha as, in some sense, part of us, part of the world we live in, something about the connection between the two. So we could think of Mahayana Buddhism as living, right? But also as Buddhism as about living. So this is something that I'll come back to here in a little bit. On one of my, I've been doing a YouTube series with the American Buddhist Studies Center, thanks to the encouragement of Hoshina Seki out there in New York. And in one of my videos, I talk a little bit about who I am and how I got here. One of the comments was like, is this an introduction to Buddhism or an introduction to you? I'm like, okay, fair point. But the reason that I talk a little bit about how I got here is because there's a lot of people claiming to represent Buddhism. And a lot of people who are presenting Buddhism in particular ways according to their particular agenda or whatever. For me, I want you to know who I am, where I come from, so that there's no surprises. Right. So first off, I'm from Tennessee. I was born in what they call Tennessee whiskey country. I grew up in Lynchburg, where Jack Daniels comes from. The air smells like whiskey sour mash, and there's no drink in the world that tastes quite like home the way that a little bit of Tennessee whiskey does. In any case, toward the end of high school, my mom got remarried and moved to Colorado. Therefore, I technically qualified for in-state tuition in Colorado. I was like, well, I've done Tennessee for 18 years. Let's go try something else out. At that time, I was also reading a lot of beat literature, you know, Jack Kerouac and Ginsberg and all those guys, and they would hang out in Denver and Boulder, and I was thinking, well, I could do that too, right? So I went to the University of Colorado Boulder. I majored in religious studies, and you know, I showed up on campus, you know, tank top, flip flop, dreadlock, going to the teacher saying, "Hey man, how do I get your job?" You know, and he looks at me, you know, the dreadlocks are flowing, got a big silver Om necklace. He could have said, "Get out of my office, hippie," but instead he took me seriously and said, well, okay, if you want to do this religious studies thing, you got to go learn Japanese. So then I majored in Japanese. And toward the end of graduating, my teacher, but my college advisor said, you know, it'd be really funny if you got an Asian studies major too, because you have the credits for it. I had to take like a 100 level sociology class. And I was like, wouldn't that be ridiculous to have a triple major? So I did that too. Right. So anyway, I wrote my thesis for undergrad on Japanese Buddhism during World War II. My intention was to be a modernist, to study modern and contemporary Japanese Buddhism. So after college, I moved to Japan to work as an English teacher, and I ended up doing a project on a local temple in rural Kumamoto where they worship a dragon bodhisattva. This dragon bodhisattva is based on the legend of the monk Koen. Koen was the teacher of Honen, who was the teacher of Shenron, who founded Jodo Shinshu, right? In the town I lived in, those billboards were everywhere. Koen was the teacher of Honen, who was the teacher of Shenron, who founded Jodo Shinshu, because everyone else was Jodo Shinshu. So you have this Shingon esoteric temple devoted to a bodhisattva dragon. Awesome, right? It'd be a good band name, right? But then their whole marketing strategy is all about how do we reach Jodo Shinshu Buddhists. I thought that was interesting, and then I returned to the U.S. and studied continued my studies, digging into Chinese Buddhism, especially Zen, Pure Land, Taoism, and other such things. And I wrote a thesis on that Bodhisattva dragon. Then I went to the University of Michigan, where I got my PhD in Buddhist studies, really focusing on medieval Japanese Buddhism. Like I said, I meant to be a modernist, but the more stuff I started digging into, next thing you know, it's like quicksand. I got drug into the medieval period, and that's where I still am. This picture here was from I believe this is maybe 2012. This is me on Mount Hiei. So I noticed something. When I show up to a temple and I'm wearing, the blazer with the elbow patches and all that with hair, I'll say, I'm a PhD student in Buddhist studies. And then the teacher will respond, Buddhism comes from India. Like, yes. Yes. So it was hard to get people to respond. So I figured, what if I shave my head? Right. So I shaved my head, and then suddenly it's like, tell me, which chapter of the Kyogyo Shinsho was your favorite? Like, suddenly the conversation begins all the way up here. I'm like, okay, I can appreciate that. Anyway, I'm wandering around Mount Hiei one day, and I happen upon a little temple. And as it turns out, this temple was the place where Honen studied with Koen, the guy that I had written about. I didn't go looking for this. I found it. So then here is a stele, Honen Shonin Tokudo Go, not the like the kind of remains of the place where Honen took ordination and where he studied under Koen. So that was a fun little coincidence. So I like this picture because it's one of the fun things that I happened to discover. Okay, all right. So let's talk about Mahayana as living Buddhism. Okay. Many of us, myself included, got our Buddhism from books. I began my own Buddhist path as what we might call a Barnes and Noble Buddhist. Indeed, it may come as a surprise, Middle Tennessee is not exactly a hotbed of Buddhist missionary activity. So the Buddhism that I could encounter was what I could find on a bookshelf at Barnes and Noble. Right. When we get our Buddhism from books, though, what we get is ideas, philosophy, and many of us encounter a Mahayana that is about diverse, complex philosophical speculation, esoteric rituals, mind-boggling art and design, and all those things are great. But that's one piece of the puzzle. Many of the people I've gotten to know both in Japan and across the US, however, have grown up in multi-generational Buddhist environments. People with that background often complain that nobody explains anything. You just show up and you do the thing you're supposed to do. You put your hands like this, you put the incense here. Nobody explains anything, right? So people with that background often comment that it's hard to see how the deep ideas actually come to life in family and in Sangha. And this is because rather than explaining what Buddhism is about, people are living out those principles that make Buddhism tick. So on the one hand, we have the Barnes and Noble Buddhists, where it's all abstract ideas. Then we have the multi-generational Buddhists, for whom it's all about practice, and they might not know a lot of the ideas. So, but we can actually bring these things together. I think by looking at how Buddhism functions in life, we can see what all this Mahayana stuff is really all about, right? So like any good writer, the point is not to explain things to you, but to show you, right? Show, don't tell. That's what they always say, right? Problem with this is that it makes people feel like they're kind of missing out on the deep stuff. But I was once told, I was enjoying a beer and some chicken teriyaki at the Denver Temple. It's back maybe 2008, 2009. And I was speaking with one of the ministers there, and they said, if you think it's all about the meditation cushion, then you don't understand Mahayana Buddhism, right? It's about community. It's about family. It's about, drinking a beer with the Buddhist priest and, watching the kids run around and all that. So I didn't understand that yet. I was still, freshly back from Japan, not yet married, not yet a father. Buddhism is still quite abstract, but I was beginning to understand what that can mean, right? We also often encounter Buddhism as a project for the individual. Many people will talk about my practice, or they'll ask you, what is your practice, as a prompt so that they can then talk about their practice. This is a thing we encounter all the time. We also, however, may encounter Buddhists for whom Buddhism is a family project, a community project. Once when I was in Japanese school, one of my classmates asked the teacher, that "Sensei, what is your religion?" Sensei, what do you mean? Mushukyo, I'm non-religious. Now, to my classmate, as a North American, that question, what is your religion, might make sense. But to many Japanese people, many people around the world, that question doesn't mean anything. What do you mean, my religion, right? So I asked the teacher a different question. I said, "Sensei, what school of Buddhism is your family affiliated with?" He said, "Oh, we are Soto Zenshu Buddhists." Right? So for him, the question not what is I, me, mine, it's we. What do we do as a family, as a community? And I feel like that really revealed something about how Mahayana Buddhism actually works outside of textbooks, right? But we'll talk about that more in a moment. So in this talk and discussion, I want to make the point that in order to understand the vast, cosmic, cosmopolitan Mahayana worldview and all of its doctrinal complexity and ritual diversity, we need to get back to basics. In this way, we can see that Mahayana is really about living Buddhism. I hope that Barnes & Noble Buddhists and multi-generational Buddhists alike can see that the Mahayana is about life, relationships, and community. In other words, with a shift in perspective, we can see that the interconnected samsara that we find ourselves in can spontaneously unfold to reveal the path to nirvana. So let's talk a little bit about, hold on, all right. So what is Mahayana Buddhism and where does it come from? Mahayana sutras claim to be the literal words of the Buddha, or at least the reported words of his disciple Ananda. As both a scholar and as a Buddhist, I would say that we can be generally skeptical about claims made within religious texts. Just as a general rule, that's a good policy to have. It makes people angry sometimes, but that's okay. That's just as a useful metric, right? Many scholars would come to argue, beginning in the 19th century, that the Mahayana evolved around 500 years after the death of the Buddha. And prophecies in texts like the Lotus Sutra seem to support this hypothesis. Anytime, this is well known within religious studies scholarship, anytime a text gives a prophecy, it will accidentally date itself. Because what scholars do is they look at the text, right? And the text will start describing history. And it'll get to a point, it'll say, and then in 100 years, this will happen. That gives you a hint when it actually happened, because then its description of events becomes wildly inaccurate, historically speaking. The scholars use the Book of Daniel in this way, which I think is very, scholars in biblical studies that do this as well. So in the Lotus Sutra, it keeps saying 500 years after the Buddha, people will persecute this text. That suggests that at least some bits of that text were written 500 years later. So as a scholar, all right, I am generally skeptical of oft-repeated claims such as these, which often seem to serve as academic orthodoxies. So we can be skeptical of the claims made within a religious text, but we can also be skeptical of claims that scholars repeat. We sometimes call it factoids, these ideas that just kind of float around and nobody asks questions. But actually through the ongoing study of Mahayana Buddhism, there are some new perspectives on what it is and where it came from. Right. One thing I'll talk about in a little bit, though, is that one of the consistent things I think we see within Mahayana Buddhism is a tendency towards critique. Critique not only of Buddhism itself, but also about the Buddhist practitioner, of self-inquiry. Getting to know how the mind works is one of the important pieces of the Mahayana. Okay. Now, more recent scholarship has called into question this idea that the Mahayana simply sprang into existence 500 years after Buddha. As we know, the Buddha didn't write anything down. In fact, nothing was written down for several hundred years until writing became more common in the the South Asian subcontinent. In the first centuries BCE, some Buddhists started writing things down in one of the various literary languages. In other words, an elite language reserved for writing. Now, in Europe, the literary language would be Latin. In East Asia, the literary language is Classical Chinese. In South Asia, in the eastern part, you have what we now call Pali, as well as Sanskrit. And these are two of the classical languages that Buddhist texts begin to be written down in. We do not have access to the first layers of the Buddhist written tradition. We do not have access to the second, third, fourth, or however many layers of this literary history. The Pali Canon, which often claims to be early Buddhism, is edited in the 4th and 5th century, almost 1,000 years after the Buddha. And interestingly, some of the earliest texts we have access to are actually the Chinese translations from various Central and South Asian languages. So many scholars of Indian Buddhism end up learning Chinese because sometimes that's the earliest datable evidence we have, is when stuff gets to China. Okay. All right, so recent scholarship on Mahayana. This one time I was listening to this conversation between scholars of so-called early Mahayana, and they actually said early Mahayana as a concept doesn't actually make sense, because that would presume that we understand what came before and what came after, and the timeline is really murky. So to call these scholars of early Mahayana Buddhism were saying amongst themselves, about themselves, to call oneself a scholar of early Mahayana Buddhism doesn't actually mean anything. Which I was like, wow, that's great. That's what I was beginning to figure out. But to hear you guys articulate it, I thought that was really great. All right. So recent scholars have revealed that the texts that came to be classified as Mahayana by later interpreters evolved gradually within a diverse early Buddhist environment that we do not have historical access to. We have copies of copies of copies of copies. In that early Buddhist environment within which these texts and ideas began to take shape, monks who revered and recited Mahayana sutras lived and practiced alongside other monks who maybe did not revere and recite Mahayana sutras. Many of the elements that we associate with Mahayana literature, the criteria we might use to determine something is Mahayana or not Mahayana, many of these elements are not wholly absent in the so-called non-Mahayana literature. And as a result, many scholars have found it to be quite helpful to read across these Mahayana and non-Mahayana texts to kind of triangulate, get an idea of what the early stuff might have looked like. In my book, Esoteric Pure Land Buddhism, I examine the idea of the Buddha Kshetra, the Buddha sphere, aka Pure Land, and how that is seen across Mahayana and non-Mahayana literature. All Buddhists agree that a Buddha purifies their sphere of influence. With the Mahayana, we have this vast cosmic worldview with limitless realms, and within what eventually becomes the non-Mahayana traditions, like the Theravada, the one that survives, it's pretty generally focused on Shakyamuni, right? But there's a lot of diversity there. Ultimately, Mahayana Sutra literature functioned in a diverse South Asian Buddhist environment for many centuries before Mahayana came to be recognized as a sociologically distinct kind of Buddhism. All right, let's take things back to basics. One of the main features of Mahayana literature is the universality of Buddha nature. And another one is critique of forms of Buddhism that seem to be deficient in their expression of compassion. There is tension within the Mahayana between the elitists and the universalists. For some Buddhists, Mahayana is the superlative path reserved for the few and the proud. One book about early Mahayana is called A Few Good Men by Jan Natye. And she is able to analyze some of these texts and say, wow, it seems that for some early Mahayanists, this is a really elitist vehicle. Only the best of the best of the best men could go do this thing. Other Mahayana Buddhists would emphasize this universality, right? Breaking down all barriers, all boundaries. Turns out all beings in the limitless realms are on the path to awakening. I tell my students, you're a little bitty baby bodhisattva and you don't even know it. You could, Lotus Sutra says, paraphrasing, of course, you could stub your toe on the way out the door and suddenly see the big picture. That's why we have all these stories of Zen masters getting walloped by their teacher and suddenly seeing, whoa, there it is. Sensei knocked me off the deck into the rain and the mud. Now I got it. Why is that? Because there's this whole other thing going on beyond our purview. Okay. Some Mahayana Buddhists, early practitioners of what becomes Mahayana Buddhism, argue that the spiritual elites of the 1st century BCE, 1st century CE, were too focused on their own liberation and not focused enough on attaining the perfect compassion of a Buddha. Now, one of the critiques we have within the Lotus Sutra, for example, is this idea that first, the nirvana that some Buddhists are looking for is just death. It's just getting out of samsara, no longer having to exist. And some Mahayana Buddhists found that to be really unsatisfying, right? One of the things that I want to emphasize before we go to this next part is, Jan Natye and her husband, John McRae, both great scholars of Buddhism, John McRae passed away a few years ago, would both mention in their works that for the Buddhist practitioner, the point of Buddhism is to see the world as it truly is. For the scholar, the point is to see Buddhism as it truly is. So that's one way in which the academic study of Buddhism and the general orientation of practice can kind of fit together. And I want to also put this other point to us that for some people, Buddhist practice is about a self-directed practice. I mean mine. For other traditions, though, again, Mahayana is very diverse, right? For other traditions, though, it's very much about other-oriented practice. This is a point I want to make because I just came back from the final ordination preparation training at the Jodo Shinshu Center. I was just in Berkeley the other day. And one of the things that I realized is that nobody's talking to me about my practice. Nobody's talking to me about their practice, right? In a month, I'm going to go to Japan to be ordained as a Buddhist priest. And all the training has been about how do you serve others? How do you train and create an environment for people to, share in the Dharma, to have this encounter with wisdom and compassion. And kind of realizing that, I was like, wow, like what a fun tradition we have, like that it's other oriented, let's say, right? Okay, so what better way to start off a discussion about Mahayana than the 6 perfections, the Roku Hara Mitsu? Okay, so first off, we have generosity or dana, and this can be the donation of time and energy. One of my favorite ways to spend time, pursuing dana is working in the kitchen. That's always my favorite way to spend time at temples is helping provide food for people. Maybe your form of dana is just showing up, right? Maybe your form of dana or generosity is helping with the website, or being a greeter at Sangha. There's all sorts of ways that we can donate our time and energy to the Buddhist community. And by the way, like, community is really central. It's often said that Americans, by that I think we mean people who encounter their Buddhism through books. We encounter Buddhism through ideas, not through community, and therefore people often deprioritize Sangha. But if we think about the life of the Buddha, he achieves awakening, and what is the first thing he does? He goes to share the Dharma with others. He goes to build Sangha. That's the first thing, is building Sangha, right? So dana, donation of time and energy. And I often think of this as just showing up, right? Just showing up can be a really powerful form of practice when you are able to do it consistently, right? So next we have ethical conduct, shila, or morality, right? Through interacting with people at our Sangha and in our families, we have the opportunity to be kind, truthful, and generous, and think about the times we may be none of those things. In our Sangha, the kids go downstairs, they do a craft activity, thing like that. They come upstairs after we've done all the chanting and discussing Dharma, and we recite the golden chain. I will be kind and gentle to every living thing. But when we do it at home, I insert the line, including my brother and sister, right? Because sometimes the kids may miss on that part of it. Every living thing includes your little brother. I know he's being a pill right now, but that's part of it too, right? So in community, we have the opportunity to think about how we show up, how we can be generous towards others, and those opportunities when we fall short, right? I think about times that I lose my temper, right? I'm really getting in touch with my bombu nature when I lose my temper, my foolish being nature, right? Next, we have patience. Now, what I like about this term, ksanti, is that it's usually translated as patience or endurance, but the sense in which ksanti can be understood as endurance is kind of this classic Mahayana issue of, like, if you understand the nature of reality, that's a lot, right? If you perceive emptiness, you stare into the void stares back. Like, is that going to wreck you? Is that going to send you into an existential depression? Seeing the world as it is a lot, So there's a lot to endure, right? So on the philosophical level, we have like the Diamond Sutra that says, when you give a gift, realize that neither you, the gift, nor the recipient fundamentally exist, right? Rather, they exist in a network of causes and conditions, not as essentially existing things, but as contingently existing things, right? But on a practical level, right, when you understand a person for who they truly are, can you love them for who they are, right? When we are participating in Sangha, this is a great way to see the difference between Buddhism as an ideal and Buddhism as a lived reality. Here's the thing about people. People are hard. People are challenging. People give you an opportunity to test your patience, right? The bodhisattva who cuts you off in traffic is giving you a precious opportunity to confront your foolish nature. Right. Next, we have diligence, virya. What's fun about Sanskrit is that Sanskrit, Latin, Greek, English, these are all historically related languages. So virya is like vigor, virile, right? So diligence, keep showing up. Sangha is all about perseverance. Just keep showing up. Yeah. Now, according to some texts, the Bodhisattva path has 52 stages, encompassing 3 incalculable eons. How can we aspire to something so lofty when we can't even get out of bed on a Saturday or Sunday? The Buddha says that spiritual friendship is the whole of the path, but you got to show up. You got to show up for your friends, or as well as the people who irritate you. Right? You got to show up for all of them. Showing up is one way that we can practice virya. Next, we have meditation, mindfulness, or concentration. Dhyana, as the term that eventually becomes Zen, right? So dhyana and meditation are often translated as Zen or Nen, as in Nembutsu, yeah? Having a practice that you are single-mindedly focused on can bring great benefit. I don't mean this in a sectarian way, but rather one-pointed concentration on whatever you're doing, right? Zen is not just about doing, sitting on a meditation cushion. It's also about doing the dishes, right? The Pure Land is not just far away, but also close, paradoxically. Right? Developing through practice mental stability. One of the ways to develop mental stability, mental clarity, is through cultivation of practice in community. Cultivating community itself can be a profound form of practice. Then we have wisdom, right? True wisdom is not simply transcendent. The Mahayana argues that nirvana is actually immanent within samsara. The light, as Shinran Shonin says, the light shines even though the clouds may appear to cover the sky of Shinjin, right? Got some neighbors walking by the window. My apologies. Okay, so all right. In other words, it is our ordinary life. It is within our ordinary life that true wisdom is revealed. You don't have to find a yogi on a mountaintop. It's right here at the potluck. So within this category of wisdom, we have things like impermanence, right? That's the way it is. That's the way of life. Openness, also known as shunyata or emptiness. No thing exists independently. No thing exists of its own accord. Everything is dependent upon other things. Everything is composite, impermanent. When we seek ultimate satisfaction in things, we will not find ultimate satisfaction there. That's the thing about things. They're not ultimately satisfactory. But also interconnectedness. Of all the diversity of the Buddhist path, one of the things that Buddhists tend to agree upon is that interconnectedness, pratitya samutpada, right, dependent arising, is at the foundation of the Buddha's enlightenment experience. What better way to understand our interconnectedness than through reflecting on family, sangha, community, all these things. These are at the foundation of the Bodhisattva's wisdom, the fundamental aspect of reality. And it is in real life, not just books or abstractions, that you encounter the causes and conditions that actually make us wise. Now, while the beginnings of the Mahayana may be mysterious, one thing we can say is that Mahayana literature reveals a contested environment with diverse texts and teachings functioning together. The point of the Lotus Sutra seems to be that there is an inherent unity despite the apparent diversity of the Buddhist path. One of my favorite texts is the Vimalakirti Sutra. Vimalakirti is so technically, Vimalakirti is a high bodhisattva who is pretending to be just an ordinary guy, right? Now, in East Asia, this comes to be interpreted as, I'm an ordinary guy, therefore I can be this great bodhisattva. I love it, right? It's not exactly what it means, but it's still the way that people often take it, right? So Vimalakirti is playing a trick on everyone. He's pretending to be sick. This is something that the Buddha does in the Lotus Sutra as well, feigning illness in order to teach. So Vimalakirti is a man about town, popular fella. People are coming to visit him on his possibly deathbed, which he uses as an opportunity to teach them about impermanence, birth, old age, sickness, and death, the things in life that are inevitable. So it is in the context of his life and his family, his friendships, and his interconnected relationships that the teaching of awakening is taking place. One of my favorite parts of the Vimalakirti Sutra is when Buddha tries to get his disciples to go visit him, and they all complain and say, no, last time I saw him, he made a fool of me, which again shows this kind of Mahayana versus non-Mahayana thing. It's often quite funny. Next, we have Tantra. Like Mahayana, the origins of Tantra are kind of fluid. We have mantras and spell texts and esoteric lineages that eventually get kind of codified to become the tantric systems that we see in Tong China, Heian Japan, and really prominently in Tibetan Buddhism. Well, one of the things we see in Tantric Buddhism is a critique of, so with the Vimalakirti, we see a critique of mainstream Buddhism. But then with Tantra, we have a critique of the idea that the body is something to be overcome, right? That the body itself is a tool for awakening, something that in this embodied, interconnected existence, it's not an obstacle, right? And, through your, especially within Tantra, through your relationship with a teacher is where you gain some of the deepest insights. And, yeah. Okay, so then we have Chan, or Zen Buddhism. Zen Buddhism, one of the slogans that we encounter is ordinary mind as the way. In a lot of Zen literature, they will emphasize doing the dishes, chopping wood, going to take a dump, just like mundane human things as potential sites for, encountering truths about the world. One of my favorite characters in Zen literature is the great monk Hui Neng. Hui Neng is an ignorant southerner. That's why I like him. And he shows up at a temple. He's like, hey, man, what are y'all up to? And next thing you know, he's working in the kitchen. He hears a line from the Diamond Sutra. And was like, I don't know what that is, but I love it. I want to learn more about that. So the great story is that he's, that they're having a poetry contest, and the straight A student writes his about, always cultivating the mind and working hard, being a good Buddhist, eat your vegetables, that type of approach. Hui Neng, who can't read, says, hey, what's that say? And then he proposes a verse in response that talks about the formless, spontaneous nature of awakening. That's one of my favorite aspects of East Asian Buddhism in general, is this integration of Chinese Taoist ideas that sometimes it's not about trying hard, sometimes it's about letting go. There's a kind of counterintuitive wisdom to just letting it be, taking a step back. Confucius says, work hard and be diligent. Lao Tzu says, retire to the country, right? And I think the Zen vibe definitely takes a lot from that, this spontaneous arising, this ignorant Southerner chopping wood. He's the one who gets it, right? Not the one who's, working, diligently. Within Zen, we also have this strong critique of over-reliance on academic or theoretical approaches. The Zen guys in China are like, some of y'all are reading too many books. You need to just be, man. And then the academics are like, yeah, you guys don't read enough. You need to quit meditating so much it's making you crazy, right? I'm paraphrasing very highfalutin debates in medieval China here. Then we get to the Shin tradition. And with Shin, we're encouraged to get in touch with our foolish nature. One time I was explaining to my son that the Jedi are kind of based on Zen monks. I got the sword, not that monks had swords necessarily, but you've got the katanas, you got the robes, are kind of like Zen robes. The pithy aphorisms are kind of riffing on, Taoism and stuff, Taoism and Buddhism and stuff. He's like, okay. They said, is there a Buddhism for the dark side? It's like, is there a Buddhism for the dark? It's like, well, I guess Shin would be, because it's all about understanding your foolish nature, the akunin, the evil being. So I guess Shin would be that. He's like, oh, well, I want to be a Shin Buddhist then. He was 7 or 8 at the time, and I was like, buddy, you're in luck. That Dharma school you've attended since you could walk. There we go. Okay, so all right. One of the other things we see with Shin is focusing on the perspective of ordinary beings. This is perhaps drawing on the classical Tiantai idea that we have emptiness, the ultimate reality on the one hand, conventional reality on the other, and then the middle where they are, seen simultaneously. With Zen, I think we often see this emphasis on talking about enlightenment to then better understand the nature of the self. But with Shin, I think the approach is slightly inverted. It is inverted perhaps. They start with the foolish being and then allow that to kind of open to something greater. Right? Within Shin as well, we have this classic Mahayana duality, right? Samsara versus nirvana, ordinary beings versus the Buddha, separateness, otherness, but at the same time, there's this ultimate unity, right? That the Shinjin, the awakening that arises within ordinary beings, is none other than the dynamic workings of the Buddha. Right? There's also an emphasis on service as practice. It's not so much about find your guru, find your magical practice. It's rather community and critical self-reflection as a way of breaking down that self-aggrandizing ego. You got to love those lines from Shinran Shonin where he says, how pitiful I am, out here just trying to become famous and, do all this. Like, you don't hear many spiritual teachers call themselves out so directly. And I think that I've always found that very refreshing. Finally, I want to conclude with the Flower Garland Sutra. Following Shinran Shonin's example, at the end of the Kyoyo Shinsho, he gives the Avatamsaka Sutra, the Flower Garland Sutra, the last word. So I'll try to copy him and do that as well. The Flower Garland Sutra concludes with this massive chapter. When I assigned it in class, it was like 300-400 pages long. It's crazy long, where we have this young boy, Sudana, who's going on a journey, meeting 52 different teachers. Got men and women, rich and poor, able-bodied, disabled, etc. He's meeting all of these different people. And through this interaction with these people, he's able to learn different perspectives. And all of these interactions, okay, this emphasizes the interconnectedness, that perhaps the 52 stages, the whole Bodhisattva path, maybe it's already here. It's already awakening. There's this natural unfolding where the struggles and pains of existence result in this mutual unfolding, where moments of cooperation and awakening can actually function together. So I'm going to conclude there. So we still have some time for questions and discussion or whatnot. But thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you for the time and energy to be here. It's always fun to dig into this stuff with people who are as excited about it as I am. All right, so I'm going to end the presentation there. All right.
Thank you very much, Sensei. It was really well done. A really nice panoramic view of the tradition in contrast to Theravadan. If anybody has any questions or comments, you can either unmute yourself and ask directly, or you can type them into the chat box if you'd like. Okay, we got one. I think this might be Ellen Crane. Were there any TV shows you watched growing up that you understand retrospectively as inspiring your interest in Buddhism? Oh, this is Elliot Cohen. It's still EC, but it's a different EC.
Well, I think so I was watching Enter the Dragon the other day, which was one of my favorites when I was younger, as well as The Last Dragon. Who doesn't love Bruce Leroy, right? And I remember, at the first scene of Enter the Dragon, it occurred to me, they're in a monastery. He's talking to a monk. So I know that I spent a lot of time watching martial arts movies and kung fu movies, like some of the old weird classics that are on late at night. I had a lot of unattended TV time, but also things like, The Karate Kid and Ninja Turtles. I'm a child of the 80s, so it was omnipresent, so something about martial arts, something about Zen, was just around. Yeah. Well, so Bruce Lee, obviously in Enter the Dragon with the Last Dragon, the character's name is Bruce Lee Roy. So if you haven't seen it, it's glorious. You got to check it out.
One thing I was going to mention, Sensei, and it's kind of going out on a limb, but if you watch Star Wars, the first 3 movies very closely, I mean, it does seem like Darth Vader is the hero. He's the one who has the epiphany at the end. Yeah. He's the one that kills the emperor. He is selfless. So I get goosebumps when I just said that, but I think he's the hero.
I can dig it. Yeah. No, I like that. The Force moves in mysterious ways. This one time I was out having a beer with one of my Shingon friends, and he was saying that this idea of the Force Awakens. This is right when that movie, The Force Awakens, came out. He was saying it's kind of like Dharmakaya, like ultimate reality as this force that is awakening beings, because the protagonists have less and less training and become more and more powerful. It's like they are the agents of the Force, and I was like, wow, right on, man. This is what happens when you drink beer with Buddhist monks, I guess.
I'm getting a lot of comments. Excellent presentation. Another person said, thank you very much. This was so enlightening and helped to connect several dots, referring to my personal spiritual practice, daily mindfulness, and community service with an exclamation point. So that's very nice comment.
Well, thank you so much. One of the other things that I want to emphasize is that, especially, again, if we're encountering Buddhism through books, we're encountering it through kind of a modern Japanese lens, we often get Buddhism as if it's made up of these distinct boxes, right? And this is because, if you want to outline a book, you need, an outline, you need bullet points, right? So keep things separate. Also, the people who tend to write books tend to be the types of people who don't like their food to touch, right? We've got our peas over here, our carrots over there, and our mashed potatoes over there. Never the twain shall meet, right? That's not what life is like. That's not what Buddhism is like. It all gets mixed up. It's all messed in there together. One of the things that I enjoy doing is that when you read the biographies of some of these great monks, you look at all the stuff they studied. They didn't leave anything out. They covered all their bases. They might specialize in, Amitabha Buddha recitation or Zen or, the Lotus Sutra, whatever. There's a lot of options, but it all connects together. I like, speaking of TV shows, Voltron. I loved Voltron as a kid. Now watching, and I'm like, oh, the 5 lions combine. It's kind of like the Buddha's in the middle of the mandala. I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist here, but that's interesting how they all kind of come together, right? Think about Buddhism like that too. We've all got the different stuff, and we all put it together in our own ways. So seeing how these things are all mutually influential is interesting, but also when reading Mahayana literature, but by literature I mean Mahayana sutras, by the way, right? Mahayana Sutra literature. A lot of scholars have argued we should study this as literature, and I love literature, so I like that. Is it when you read one and you read another, there's some harmony, right? So the texts as we have them now were kind of produced in an environment where they're mutually influencing one another. So you read the Lotus, you read the Avatamsaka, you read the Pure Land Sutras. It's like, oh, this is starting to make sense, right? So that's one of the other things I want to emphasize is that the stuff does all connect, right?
Another comment from Elliot was, this was really great. I particularly appreciated the emphasis on family. This often gets missed out as Western Buddhism can become a very individualistic practice.
That's absolutely right. But, you know, having so I first encountered Buddhism as a living family thing, living in rural Japan. I had friends and neighbors and English students and other people taking me to their temples, taking me to visit their family. And I remember one time I went to the home of a mikan farmer, Japanese Mandarin orange farmer. And by the way, getting to know them, I didn't have to buy oranges for the rest of the year. Like I just would occasionally get a crate of stuff. It was fantastic. Anyway, so but the showing up at their house and getting to meet their village priest, then seeing the little kids just like reciting something from memory, maybe Shoshinge, maybe Jusege, I don't really know, but it just all kept coming out. I was like, wow, like this is their thing. They're excited to share it, right? So then I get older, I become a father, and I keep thinking about how valuable Buddhism has been for me and how I don't want it to just be that weird thing that dad does for my kids. I want it to be a resource that they can draw upon. And otherwise I would feel like a parent who made a bunch of money and gave none to their kids. Like, because I don't have wealth, I have the Dharma, so I don't want to share what jewels I do have with the 3 jewels or with them, right? So then me and a friend started a Sangha, but we started a Dharma school that then evolved into the Sangha we have now, but it all began with kids. Like, how do we share this as families, right? And now my daughter's almost a teenager. She's babysitting for fellow Sangha members. And I'm like, this is what it's about. You know, the kids make the food. They prepare the meal for the potluck we have once a month, and they interact with each other in other community events. And like, well, this is what it's about. Here it's happening.
Right.
Yeah, family.
Here's a question that's kind of hard. I think I could answer the first 2 bits, but not the last bit. It says, can you speak about Buddhism, the Patanjali Sutra, I think, which is, the one my wife always references as a yoga instructor, and they're linked to shamanism.
Actually, yes, I can't speak on this.
Wow, good, because I
All
can't.
right, so the Yoga Sutra is influenced by a school of Buddhist philosophy known as Yogacara. Funny thing about the word Yogacara, yoga kind of means the practice. Chara kind of means practice. So Yogacara kind of means the practice of the practice, right? The practice is the practice. I feel like that's a slogan. The practice is the practice. Okay. Anyway, so Yogacara it's many things, but it's also about understanding how the mind coordinates sensory input. You have eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind, right? So they imagined in ancient India they had, they didn't know what the brain did, I don't think, but they knew that there had to be some part of the sensory strata that coordinated the other senses. Based on that, we get the ego mind, and based on that, we get this karmic continuity over many lifetimes. So this is one of the very important foundational Mahayana schools of philosophy. One of the things that's kind of fun, if you know Mahayana Buddhism and then you study Hinduism, you find out that a lot of the stuff that we now associate with Hinduism kind of comes from Buddhism, and there's been a lot of back and forth between the two for a really long time. And this particular Yoga Sutra is one example. There's the Vedanta school, and the funny thing about Vedanta is Adi Shankara plagiarized a whole bunch of stuff from Buddhism, while also criticizing Buddhism. But that's just kind of how it was. It's you write a strongly worded letter to your opponent and then also crib their notes. Like we see the same thing happening in medieval Japan, right? Now this question of shamanism. So the word shaman comes from Siberia, and many scholars have come to use the term shaman as kind of a generic catch-all term for everything not otherwise delineated as Buddhist, Taoist, Confucian, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, whatever, right? So it has kind of become this generic term. But if what we mean by shamanism is like spirit spirit mediums or people who are communicating with the dead, communicating with the spirit world, and serving as that kind of key function, or entering into ecstatic states. Practicing yoga can put you into an ecstatic state. I'll also mention that there is a linguistic theory. I don't know if it's true, but there's a theory that I heard once that the word shaman in Siberia may actually come from shramana, meaning Buddhist monk.
Mhm.
And if we think about how Buddhism all over the world has integrated with local traditions, right? Highland spirit houses, Japanese Shinto, Korean shamanism, Mongolian shamanism, Taoism and Buddhism. Buddhism always blends in with other stuff. So a lot of Buddhism is very shamanistic, right? Especially on the Tantra side. There's a book about Tibetan Buddhism called Civilized Shamans. I don't know what that title, but it kind of gets the point that these ecstatic techniques for engaging with the spirits, with the mind, with the universe, they're very diverse, and perhaps Buddhism plays an important role in that. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I'm impressed. So I really wanted to thank you so much for attending and participating with Everyday Buddhist. We've really learned a lot today. I just realized, we had Dr. Aaron Proffitt, and in a couple months, we may be able to invite somebody brand new, Reverend Dr. Aaron Proffitt.
I know, it's so weird.
So that'll be great. That'll be great. And they said, thank you for the clarification. Oh, I guess the book's called, Civilized Shamanism. Got another thank you. So thank you very much, Sensei. And
Thank you so much.
really appreciate it. This concludes our live event for the month of August. And before I forget, we have a save the date for September 3rd. We will have another guest speaker series. It's entitled Gratitude, A Path to Awakening with Reverend Dr. Kenji Akahoshi. And so we do this at Everyday Buddhist. We try to release either a live event or a guest speaker series every month as new content. So it's on its way. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. I hope you will partake in this bit of content for the month of September. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.